Welcome back. If you're looking for ghost stories or tales of demons hiding under the bed, you're in the wrong place. Tonight, we're talking about something far worse. We're talking about what happens to ordinary people when the world goes dark, when the food runs out, and when survival demands the unthinkable. If you enjoy real, grounded, disturbing stories like these, make sure to subscribe, leave a like on the video, and share it with a friend who appreciates late-night horror. And before we begin, tell me down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Have you ever been completely alone in the wilderness and felt like you were being watched? Let me know. Dim the lights, turn up the volume. Let's begin. The year was 1654. I was 28 years old, a trained physician working under the harsh, watchful eyes of the magistrates in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Back then, the world was small. Civilization was a thin strip of wood and mud clinging to the edge of an endless black continent. If you walked out of the colony and stepped into the tree line, you didn't belong to the law anymore. You belonged to the winter. You belonged to the quiet. I am writing this because I have to, because the official records state that the settlement of Gideon's Ridge was lost to a harsh winter and a sudden outbreak of pox. That is a lie. I know it's a lie because I was the man they sent to find out why the supply wagons stopped coming. I was the man who walked into Gideon's Ridge, and I am the only man who walked out. It took me 4 days to ride from Boston to the foothills. The road was barely a scratch in the dirt, twisting through ancient pines that were so thick they blocked out the sun even at noon. It was late November. The cold wasn't just in the air, it felt like it was inside my lungs, heavy and sharp. Gideon's Ridge was a logging and trapping outpost. It was supposed to be a community of 42 people, hard men, resilient women, and a handful of children. They were led by a man named Silas Vance, a charismatic, devout man who convinced those families to follow him into the deep woods to build a pure, isolated utopia. For 2 years, they sent timber and furs back to Boston. Then, in September of 1654, the shipments stopped. The riders who usually brought the mail did not return. October passed in absolute silence. By November, the governor quietly hired me to ride up there. My job was simple: assess the health of the settlement, treat any disease I found, and report back. I packed my medical bags with dried herbs, bandages, and surgical tools. I should have packed a heavier musket. I arrived at the edge of the settlement just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. When my horse broke through the tree lawn, I expected to see smoke rising from the chimneys. I expected to hear the chop of axes or dogs barking. There was nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. It was so quiet, the crunch of my horse's hooves and the frost sounded like gunshots. The settlement was comprised of about 15 log cabins arranged in a tight circle around a central meeting house. But as I rode closer, my stomach twisted into a cold, heavy knot. There was no sign of a struggle. No burned buildings, no broken doors. The settlement was perfectly intact. The wood was chopped and neatly stacked by the doors. The water barrels were covered, but the windows were dark. I tied my horse to a post outside the meeting house. I called out, "Hello, I am Dr. Elias Thorne, sent from Boston." My voice just bounced off the trees and died. I drew my flintlock pistol. The metal was freezing against my palm. I approached the nearest cabin, the home of the Miller family, according to the map I was given. I pushed the heavy wooden door open. It creaked slowly, revealing a pitch-black interior. I lit a lantern, and what I saw inside made no sense. The table was set. 3 wooden bowls sat on the table.
In them, a thick stew had frozen completely solid, covered in a thin layer of mold. The beds were made, the clothes were folded in the corner, but the people were gone. I checked the next cabin. The same thing. Then the next. Beds made, tools neatly hung on the walls, fireplaces swept clean. 42 people had seemingly evaporated into the winter air, leaving their entire lives perfectly organized behind them. I felt a creeping paranoia crawling up the back of my neck. In the wild, people don't just vanish. If it was an Indian raid, there would be blood, fire, arrows. If it was disease, there would be bodies, or at least graves. There were no graves. The ground outside was completely undisturbed. By nightfall, I had searched every cabin. Every single one was empty. The temperature was plummeting, dropping well below freezing. I knew I couldn't ride back in the dark, so I decided to barricade myself inside the central meeting house. It was the largest structure, solidly built, with heavy iron latches on the doors. I built a small fire in the hearth. I sat in a wooden chair, my pistol resting on my knee, staring at the door. I told myself it was just a relocation. Maybe the water supply went bad, and they all moved to a winter camp. But I knew that wasn't true. The frozen stew on the tables. They didn't pack. They didn't plan to leave. Around midnight, the wind began to howl outside. It shrieked through the gaps in the logs, sounding like human voices. I was exhausted, shivering, trying to stay awake. That's when I noticed it. Underneath the heavy wooden floorboards, a smell. It was faint at first, masked by the wood smoke, but as the fire warmed the room, the smell grew stronger, sweet, sickly, chemical. As a physician, I knew that smell. It was the smell of lye, heavy, concentrated lye, used to break down organic matter. I grabbed my lantern and knelt on the floor. I ran my fingers along the rough-hewn planks until I found a seam that wasn't nailed down. I wedged my hunting knife in the crack and pried the heavy wood board up. There was a root cellar beneath the meeting house. A ladder disappeared into the darkness. The stench rising from that hole was so overpowering I violently gagged, dropping my knife. I covered my mouth with a cloth, picked up my lantern, and slowly descended the ladder. The cellar was massive, running the entire length of the building, but it wasn't used for storing potatoes or grain. Stacked against the far wall were wooden crates, dozens of them, but they weren't provision crates. They were long, narrow, and hastily nailed together. They were coffins, but they were too small for adults. I walked toward them, my lantern light trembling as my hand shook. I used the butt of my pistol to smash the iron nails off the lid of the nearest box. I pulled the wood back. Inside were stones, just large, heavy river stones, carefully arranged to match the weight of a human body. I opened the next one. Stones. I opened a third. Stones. I stood there in the freezing dark, my mind violently trying to reject what I was seeing. Why would a settlement build coffins, fill them with rocks, and hide them under the floorboards? And where was the lye smell coming from? I turned my lantern toward the back corner of the cellar. There was a massive wooden vat, like the one used for tanning hides. I approached it. The liquid inside was thick, dark, and perfectly still. Floating at the very top, perfectly preserved by the freezing temperature and the chemicals, was a child's linen bonnet.
I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat was paralyzed. I backed away from the vat, my boots scraping against the dirt floor. My foot hit something hard. I looked down. It was a heavy, leather-bound book tucked beneath a burlap sack. I grabbed the book, scrambled up the ladder, and slammed the floorboard shut.
I dragged a heavy oak table over the floorboard, locking whatever was down there away from me. I collapsed by the fire, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I opened the book. It was Silas Vance's ledger, the leader of the settlement. The first 50 pages were exactly what you'd expect. Grain yields, fur tallies, births, minor disputes. But starting in late August, the handwriting changed. It became erratic. The ink was pressed so hard into the parchment it tore through the pages. The entries didn't describe a disease. They described a philosophy. August 24th, the ledger read. The blight has taken the winter wheat. The storage silos are half empty. I have done the mathematics. 42 souls require 3 pounds of grain a week. The snows will come soon. We cannot feed 42. We can only feed 20. I turned the page. September 2nd. The weak consume the resources of the strong. The children cannot hunt. The elderly cannot chop wood. To let us all starve equally is a sin against God. To survive, the body must amputate a dying limb. My eyes darted down the page, scanning the manic, cramped words. Silas hadn't lost his mind. He had applied cold, brutal, flawless logic to a survival scenario. He didn't murder his people with a knife. He did it with the evening meals. September 12th, the journal read. I have gathered the white snake root and the autumn skullcap from the woods. Boiled down, it has no taste in a heavy venison stew. The Miller family complained of a deep fatigue after supper. By morning, their hearts had stopped in their sleep. It is a peaceful culling. It is necessary. I stared at the fire, shivering uncontrollably. He had poisoned them. He had systematically poisoned the weakest members of his own settlement, tucking them into bed so they would die quietly. And the remaining 20 strong men and women, they helped him hide the bodies in the lye vat to melt the evidence away, so if Boston ever came looking, they wouldn't find mass graves. They filled the crates with rocks to balance the weight of the supply wagons they planned to send back in the spring. A collective agreement to commit atrocities just to make it through the winter. I looked at the final entry in the book. It was dated just 2 days ago, November 18th. The winter is colder than expected. 20 is still too many. We must reduce the number to 10. Those of us who remain will move to the high hunting cabin in the peaks. We leave the settlement intact. If the magistrates send a scout, he will find nothing. I froze. If the magistrates send a scout. Suddenly, the sound of the wind howling outside the cabin stopped. For a brief moment, the woods were dead silent. And then I heard it. Crunch. A footstep in the snow, just outside the heavy wooden door of the meeting house. Crunch. Then another. Then a low, steady whisper coming from the other side of the wood. I see the lantern light, Dr. Thorne. Are you reading my book?
I see the lantern light, Dr. Thorne. Are you reading my book? The voice on the other side of the heavy oak door wasn't screaming. It wasn't angry. It was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. I stood frozen in the center of the meeting house, the heavy leather ledger still gripped in my left hand, my flintlock pistol shaking in my right. "Silas Vance?" I choked out. My voice betrayed my terror. "Yes, doctor," the voice replied. The wood of the door muffled him slightly, but I could hear the smile in his words. "I apologize for the cold welcome. We did not expect a magistrate's man until the spring thaw. You must be freezing. Unbar the door.
We have a fire going at the upper camp." I backed away, my boots scraping the floorboards. "I went into the cellar, Silas," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative. "I saw the vat. I saw the stones in the crates. In the name of the governor of Massachusetts, you are under arrest." A low, dry laugh echoed from the porch outside. "The governor of Massachusetts is a 4-day ride away, Elias," Silas said, his voice dropping its friendly facade, replacing it with something cold and metallic. "The law doesn't survive out here in the deep frost. Only the strong survive. I did what nature demanded. You read the ledger. You are an educated man, a man of medicine. Surely you understand amputation." "You murdered your own people," I yelled. "I saved my people," Silas corrected, his voice hardening. "The weak would have dragged us all into starvation. I simply made the choice that God was too cowardly to make. Now, hand the book through the window, Doctor, and we will let you ride back to Boston. You can tell them the pox took us. A tragedy. Everyone wins." I wasn't a fool. I knew the moment I opened that door, my throat would be cut and my body would join the others in the lye vat beneath the floorboards. I would just be another tragic casualty of the Gideon's Ridge plague. But then, I heard it. It wasn't just Silas outside. I heard the distinct crunch, crunch, crunch of snow compressing around the sides of the meeting house. Shadows began to blot out the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. 1, 2, 4, 8. The remaining survivors, the strong ones, they were surrounding the building. They weren't acting like a frenzied mob. There was no shouting, no torches. It was a methodical, organized encirclement. They were hunting me the exact same way they had slaughtered their neighbors, with quiet, calculated efficiency. "He's not going to open it, Silas," a woman's voice whispered from the back window. It was a mother's voice, gentle, ruthless. "Bring the axes," Silas replied from the front door. Thwack! The first axe bit into the heavy oak door. The whole building shuddered. I panicked. I looked around the room. The windows were too narrow for me to squeeze through quickly, and they were already guarded. The front door was being splintered. My eyes fell on the floorboards I had pushed the table over. The root cellar. Thwack! The wood of the door splintered inward. The iron hinges groaned. I threw my weight against the heavy oak table, scraping it across the floor. I grabbed the lantern, shoved my pistol into my belt, and pried the loose floorboard up. The overwhelming, sickening stench of lye and decay hit me in the face, but I didn't care. I swung my legs into the dark hole and dropped onto the cellar ladder. I pulled the floorboard shut right above my head, just as the front door of the meeting house gave way with a deafening crash. Heavy boots pounded onto the floor right above me. "He's not here," a man shouted above. "Check the windows! Check the rafters!" Silas commanded. I clung to the ladder in the pitch-black cellar. I had blown out my lantern the moment I dropped down. I was completely enveloped in darkness, surrounded by coffins filled with rocks, breathing air so thick it burned the back of my throat. Above me, I heard a scrape. Someone was dragging the table back. "The floorboard," the woman's voice said. I didn't wait. I dropped the remaining 10 feet into the dark, landing hard on the dirt floor. I bit my tongue to keep from crying out. I remembered from the brief time I had the lantern lit, root cellars like this usually had a ventilation shaft dug into the earth at the back to prevent rot, a small tunnel leading outside, covered by a wooden grate. I scrambled on my hands and knees through the pitch black, my hands brushing against the rough wood of the fake coffins. My shoulder bumped hard against the massive wooden lye vat. The dark liquid sloshed inside, and I felt something soft and wet brush against the back of my neck in the dark. I choked back a sob of pure revulsion and kept crawling. Above me, The floorboard was ripped open. A beam of lantern light shot down into the cellar. "He's down there!" a voice yelled. I reached the dirt wall at the back of the cellar. My hands frantically clawed at the frozen earth until my fingers caught the edge of a wooden grate. I pulled. It was frozen shut. Behind me, boots were hitting the dirt floor. They were coming down the ladder. I pulled with everything I had. My fingernails tore, blood slicking the wood. With a sickening crack, the ice broke. The grate swung open, revealing a narrow tunnel leading up to the snowy surface. I squeezed myself into the dirt shaft, worming my way upward like a rat. "I see him!" a man roared from the cellar behind me. A deafening bang echoed in the confined space. A musket ball slammed into the dirt just inches from my foot, showering my face in frozen mud. I burst out of the tunnel into the freezing night air, scrambling from under the back foundation of the meeting house. I didn't look back, I just ran. I plunged directly into the thick black tree line of the New England wilderness. The snow was knee-deep, dragging at my boots like wet sand. Branches whipped my face, tearing my skin. The cold was absolute, biting through my wool coat in seconds. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I ran until I couldn't hear the shouts of the men behind me. I collapsed at the base of a massive, ancient pine tree, gasping for air, clutching the leather ledger to my chest. I was miles away from the settlement, deep in the unmarked wilderness. I had no horse, I had no food, I had a single-shot pistol, a book full of confessions, and the clothes on my back. The temperature was dropping fast. If I didn't keep moving, the cold would kill me before Silas ever found me. I forced myself to stand up. I looked back the way I came. Through the dense trees, perhaps a mile back, I saw them. 5 small orange dots of light spread out in a perfect sweeping line across the forest. Lanterns. They weren't running. They weren't screaming in a frenzied search. They were walking slowly, methodically, sweeping the woods grid by grid. It was the calm, terrifying coordination of people who had done this before, people who were used to hunting things down in the dark and making them disappear. They were tracking my footprints in the snow. I backed away into the shadows, turning to head deeper up the mountain, toward the jagged, frozen peaks. But as I turned, my boot caught on something buried under the snow. I tripped, falling hard into a snowbank. My hand brushed against something frozen. I pulled my hand back and brushed the snow away. It was a face. A young man, maybe 16 years old, half buried in the snowdrift. His skin was blue. His eyes were open, staring up at the empty sky. But it wasn't the frost that killed him. I stared in absolute horror at his leg. It was caught in a massive, rusted iron trap, with teeth like a wolf, a bear trap. He hadn't been poisoned. He had realized what Silas was doing, and he had tried to run. And as I sat there in the snow, looking at the dead boy, I heard a metallic clink in the dark woods just a few feet to my left, and then another clink to my right. I slowly raised my head, peering into the blackness between the trees. They hadn't just been hunting him. They had mined the entire perimeter of the woods with traps to ensure nobody could escape the settlement. And I was standing right in the middle of them.
I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was standing in a graveyard of iron, buried beneath a foot of fresh snow. I had just found the body of a boy whose leg had been shattered by a rusted bear trap, left to freeze to death in the dark. And somewhere in the pitch-black woods around me, I had heard the distinct metallic clink of a chain shifting. Down the ridge, the 5 orange lanterns were sweeping back and forth. They were less than a quarter-mile away now. I could hear the rhythmic crunch of their boots. I needed to run, but if I took a blind step in any direction, a pair of iron jaws would snap my shin bone in half, pinning me to the ground until Silas arrived to finish the job. I knelt down in the snow,
my hands trembling violently. I reached out to the dead boy. I didn't want to touch him, but his fingers were rigidly wrapped around a thick, broken pine branch. He must have used it as a walking stick before the trap caught him. I pried the branch from his frozen grip. I whispered a quick, silent apology to God and stood up. I held the branch out in front of me, sweeping it across the surface of the snow, pressing it down into the powder. Crunch. Soft. I took a step. I pressed the branch into the snow ahead of my left foot. Crunch. Soft. I took another step. The lanterns were getting closer. I could hear their voices now, low, casual murmurs. They weren't panicked. They were hunting a trapped animal. I swept the branch to the right. Clang! The snow erupted. Two massive, rusted iron jaws snapped shut around the thick pine branch, with enough force to send a shockwave up my arm. The metal teeth bit deep into the wood, splintering it instantly. I ripped my hand back, falling into the snow. My heart stopped. The sound of that trap snapping shut in the dead, silent winter night was like a cannon firing. Down the ridge, the 5 lanterns instantly stopped moving. "Did you hear that?" A man's voice echoed through the trees. "Lower hollow," Silas replied, perfectly calm. He found the perimeter. "Bring the ropes." The lanterns immediately changed direction, moving straight toward me at a terrifying speed. They weren't sweeping anymore. They were sprinting. I abandoned the branch. I abandoned the slow, careful probing. I just ran. I plunged blindly into the dark tree line, leaping over snowdrifts, praying with every step that my boot would find solid earth and not cold iron. Adrenaline flooded my system, numbing the freezing cold. Snap! Right behind me, less than an inch from my heel. I didn't even look back. I scrambled up a steep embankment, my hands clawing at the frozen roots of an overturned oak tree. I crested the ridge and threw myself over the other side, sliding uncontrollably down a sheer drop into a narrow, frozen ravine. I crashed through a thicket of dead briars, tearing the skin on my face and hands before slamming hard into the frozen creek bed at the bottom. I lay there in the dark, gasping, my lungs burning, the taste of copper in my mouth. Above me, at the top of the ridge, the orange glow of the lanterns began to bleed through the trees. I dragged myself underneath the hollowed-out root system of a massive dead tree overhanging the creek. It formed a small, shallow cave of dirt and twisted wood. I curled my body into a tight ball, pressing myself against the freezing earth, pulling my dark wool coat over my head to hide my face. I pulled my flintlock pistol from my belt. I cocked the hammer back. It was a single shot. There were 5 of them. Boots crunched on the ridge right over my head. Snow cascaded down the embankment, dusting my coat. "He came down this way," a heavy, exhausted voice panted. "Look at the tracks," Silas said. His voice was directly above me. He was standing on the very roots that were hiding me. "He's panicked." "Silas, it's freezing," a woman's voice said. Her teeth were chattering. "We've been out here for an hour. Let him go. He'll freeze before he makes it to Boston." "No, Martha," Silas replied. His tone was patient, like a school teacher correcting a slow pupil. "If he freezes, a spring hunting party will find his body. They will find the book, and they will hang all of us. He cannot just die. He has to disappear, just like the others." I held my breath. My chest was screaming for air, but I didn't dare exhale. I could hear the sickening logic in his voice. This wasn't a frenzy of bloodlust. This was the cold, terrifying mathematics of survival. "Go down into the creek bed, Martha," Silas ordered. "Take your lantern. Check beneath the roots." My grip on the pistol tightened. If she looked under the root system, she would see me. I would have to shoot her, and the moment I fired, the other 4 men would descend on me and tear me to pieces. I heard her boots sliding down the embankment. Crunch, crunch. The yellow light of her lantern bled into my small dirt cave, casting long spider-like shadows through the twisted roots. Crunch. She stopped. She was standing right in front of the opening. Her toes of her leather boots were 6 inches from my face. I slowly, agonizingly raised my pistol, aiming it straight through the gap in the roots. The lantern swung down. The light hit my face. Through the tangled roots, I locked eyes with Martha. She was young, maybe 25. Her face was gaunt, hollowed out by hunger and exhaustion. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a profound, soul-crushing terror. She looked at the gun pointed at her stomach. Then she looked at my face. She knew what Silas had done. She knew about the poison stew. She knew about the lie wat. She had chosen to stay quiet because she wanted to live. It was the horrific complicity of a normal person pushed to the absolute edge. She stared at me for 3 long seconds. The silence between us was deafening. I didn't shoot. I just shook my head, silently begging her. Martha's throat swallowed hard. She blinked away a tear that instantly froze on her cheek. She turned her head, looking back up the ridge toward Silas. "Nothing down here, Silas," her voice called out, remarkably steady. "Just a dead deer frozen in the ice. The tracks go across the creek and into the deep pines." "Very well," Silas sighed above us. "We cross the creek. Keep a wide perimeter." Martha didn't look back at me. She simply lifted her lantern, turned around, and walked away, her light slowly fading into the darkness. I lowered the gun. My entire body was shaking so violently I could hear my teeth clicking together. I had survived, for now. I waited until the faint glow of their lanterns disappeared completely into the woods across the creek. Only then did I dare to move. I carefully pushed myself up into a sitting position within the cramped dirt hollow. I reached into my coat pocket to check that Silas's ledger was still safe. But as I shifted my weight in the dark, my hand brushed against something soft, something that wasn't dirt, something that wasn't wood. It was cloth, heavy wool cloth. I froze. I reached out blindly in the pitch black. My fingers traced the edge of the wool. It was a coat. My hand moved higher. I felt a cold, stiff shoulder, and then I felt a face. But it wasn't a dead body, because as my fingers brushed against its frozen cheek, the face turned toward me in the dark, and a dry, raspy voice whispered directly in my ear. "Did they leave?"
Did they leave? I threw myself backward against the frozen dirt wall of the hollow, raising my flintlock pistol in the pitch black. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely keep my finger on the trigger. "Who is that?" I breathed, my voice barely audible over the wind. "Don't shoot." The voice rasped. It was weak, so weak it sounded like dry leaves scraping together. "Please, don't shoot. The flash will bring him back." I lowered the pistol an inch. My eyes were finally adjusting to the absolute darkness of the root cave. Faint blue moonlight was reflecting off the snow outside, bleeding just enough light into our hiding space. It was a girl. She looked no older than 14. She was buried under a pile of filthy, frozen wool blankets, huddled so deeply into the dirt she looked like a corpse that had been unearthed by the frost. Her face was hollow, smeared with mud, and her lips were a bruised, terrifying shade of purple. But it was her eyes that made my blood run cold. They were wide, hyper-aware, and completely devoid of hope. They were the eyes of a wild animal that had been chewed on by a trap and was just waiting to die. "Who are you?" I whispered, crawling an inch closer. "Abigail." She shivered, pulling the rigid wool tighter around her throat. "Abigail Miller. The Miller family. The name echoed in my mind like a gunshot. I had just read Silas Vance's ledger an hour ago. September 12th. The Miller family complained of a deep fatigue after supper. By morning, their hearts had stopped in their sleep. It is a peaceful culling. Silas wrote that your whole family died, I whispered, my stomach twisting into a heavy knot. Abigail let out a broken, wheezing cough. She covered her mouth to muffle the sound. They did. Her voice was terrifyingly flat. He gave us a heavy venison stew. My mother, my father, my little brother, they ate it all, but it tasted bitter, like crushed leaves. I only took one bite, and I hid the rest in my napkin. I watched them fall asleep, but they didn't wake up. She closed her eyes. A single tear escaped, instantly freezing on her cheek. When Silas and the men came to the cabin the next morning to collect the bodies, I hid under the floorboards. I heard them talking about the lie about the coffins filled with rocks. I stared at her in absolute horror. This child had been hiding out here in the frozen wilderness for 2 months, surviving on pine needles, melted snow, and whatever scraps she could steal from the traps. Abigail, you have to come with me, I whispered, reaching out to grab her shoulder. I'm a doctor. I'm from Boston. I have Silas's ledger. We are going to get out of this forest, and we are going to hang him. I promise you. I pulled on her blanket to help her up. She didn't move. Abigail, come on. We have to move before they circle back. I can't, she said. Yes, you can. I'll carry you. No, doctor, she whispered, pulling the blanket back from her legs. In the faint blue moonlight, I saw why she hadn't run. Her legs from the knees down were completely black. The tissue was dead, hardened like charred wood. Frostbite had taken her weeks ago. She couldn't walk. She couldn't even stand. She had crawled into this dirt hole to die. I sat back on my heels, the breath knocked completely out of me. As a physician, I knew instantly that even if I got her to Boston tonight, she wouldn't survive the amputation. The gangrene had already spread too far into her blood. I'm not leaving, Abigail said softly, her voice completely devoid of panic. But you have to. You have the book. The book is the only thing that proves we existed. He wants to erase us, Doctor. He wants the world to think we just faded away into the winter. She reached out with a trembling, frostbitten hand and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Listen to me, Doctor, she breathed, her breath ghosting across my face. You cannot just run through the trees. He has layered the perimeter with iron jaws. You'll lose a leg before you make it a mile. I know, I said. I found a boy. He was caught in one. That was Thomas, she whispered, her eyes dropping to the dirt. He tried to run last week. I heard him screaming for hours. But I know how Silas laid the traps. I watched him do it from the ridge. She pulled me closer, forcing me to listen. Follow the creek bed for half a mile. Do not step onto the banks. Walk directly on the frozen ice. The ice is too hard for them to bury the iron. When the creek splits at the giant boulder, take the right fork up the jagged rocks. It's too steep for the traps. It will lead you straight to the mountain pass. Come with me, I pleaded, tears finally stinging my own eyes. I can't just leave you in a hole in the dirt. Abigail offered a small, broken smile. It was the most heartbreaking thing I had ever seen. I'm already gone, Dr. Thorne. Just don't let him erase me. I squeezed her hand. I took off my heavy wool coat and wrapped it tightly around her frail shoulders, leaving myself in just my vest and undershirt. The cold hit me immediately, biting into my skin like hundreds of tiny needles, but I didn't care. I clutched the heavy leather ledger to my chest. I will come back with the magistrates, I swore to her. I turned away from her, crawling on my stomach toward the opening of the root cave. I pushed my head out into the freezing wind, looking left and right. The woods were dark. The lanterns were gone. I slid out of the dirt hollow onto the frozen surface of the creek. I stood up slowly, my boots slipping slightly on the smooth ice.
I looked back at the tangled roots one last time, and then I heard it. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't the crunch of a boot. It was a deep gutter of vibrating sound echoing through the pines. A hoo. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was a hound, a hunting dog, and it wasn't alone. A second howl joined it, then a third, rising into a terrifying chorus of starved, violent animals. Silas hadn't just brought his men. He'd gone back to the settlement and released the dogs. They were tracking my scent. I looked down the winding frozen ribbon of the creek, half a mile to the boulder. The hounds bayed again. They were close, so close I could hear the brush snapping under their massive paws. I didn't think, I just ran.
The hounds bayed again. It wasn't the distant, echoing sound of a hunting pack. It was a vicious, starving roar, and it was coming from the tree line directly behind me. Without my heavy wool coat, the winter air hit my sweat-soaked shirt and instantly turned it to a sheet of ice against my skin. But the cold was nothing compared to the pure animal terror pumping through my veins. I hit the frozen surface of the creek and broke into a dead sprint. Slip, catch, sprint. My leather boots offered absolutely no grip on the smooth blue ice. Every step was a chaotic gamble. The creek wound through the dense black pines like a frozen snake. On either side of me, the snow-covered banks rose up like dark walls. I knew what was buried in those banks. Abigail had warned me. The iron bear traps. If I slipped off the ice and my foot hit the powder, my run was over. Behind me, the brush exploded. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them, the scraping of massive claws on the ice, the heavy, wet snarls. These weren't hounds meant for chasing foxes. These were the settlement's guard dogs, massive, brutal mastiffs trained to tear wolves apart. And Silas had starved them just enough to make them desperate. I pushed my burning legs harder. My lungs felt like they were filling with battery acid. "Help me, God," I gasped aloud, my breath pluming in the dark air. Crack! I stopped breathing. The sound didn't come from behind me. It came from beneath my feet. The ice under my left boot spiderwebbed with a sickening, high-pitched fracture. The creek wasn't frozen solid all the way through. I lost my footing and slammed hard onto my knees. The impact sent a jolt of pure agony up my spine. My hands slapped the ice to brace my fall, and the freezing water instantly seeped through the cracks, soaking my palms. If I fell through, the current would drag me under the ice. I would drown in the freezing dark. A terrifying snarl erupted right behind my ear. I threw myself sideways, rolling violently across the slick ice, just as a massive black shape launched through the air where my head had been a fraction of a second before. The mastiff hit the ice with a heavy thud, its claws scrambling frantically for purchase. It was enormous, over 100 pounds of muscle, matted fur, and snapping jaws. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees. The dog locked eyes with me, bared teeth dripping with saliva, and lunged. I kicked out with my heavy leather boot. The heel connected squarely with the beast's snout. The dog yelped, sliding backward on the ice, but a second hound was already breaking through the tree line, its eyes reflecting the faint moonlight like yellow coins. I had to get off the ice. I scrambled to my feet, slipping wildly, and looked ahead. There, looming in the darkness about 50 yards away, was a massive, jagged shadow. The boulder. The split in the creek. I bolted. The first dog recovered and was right on my heels. I could literally hear its jaws snapping at the air inches from my calves. I reached the massive rock formation where the creek split. Abigail had told me to take the right fork up the jagged rocks, too steep for the iron traps. I leapt off the ice and threw my body against the frozen vertical stone. My bare, bleeding hands clawed at the sharp crevices. I hauled myself up, kicking my boots into the narrow cracks. Snap! The mastiff leaped,
its jaws clamping down on the heel of my boot. The weight of the massive animal yanked me downward. My fingers scraped agonizingly against the frost-covered stone, tearing my nails. I screamed, clinging to the rock face with everything I had. I drew my flintlock pistol from my belt with my free hand. I pointed it straight down at the snarling mass of fur and teeth pulling at my leg. But I didn't pull the trigger. If I fired, the gunshot would echo for miles. Silas would know exactly where I was. Instead, I flipped the heavy iron pistol around in my hand, gripping the barrel. I swung the heavy wooden handle down like a hammer, smashing it directly between the dog's ears. With a whimper, the mastiff released my boot and fell back, tumbling down the rocks and crashing onto the ice below. I didn't stop. I holstered my weapon and climbed higher and higher, scrambling up the sheer rock face until I finally collapsed over the top edge of the ridge. I lay flat on the freezing stone, staring up at the black sky, violently gasping for air. My hands were shredded. My clothes were soaked. I was shivering so uncontrollably I could barely feel my fingers. But I was alive. I had outsmarted the dogs. I had outsmarted the traps. I had the ledger tucked safely against my chest. I slowly pushed myself up onto my knees and looked back over the edge of the cliff. Far below, I saw the 5 orange lanterns emerge from the tree line and stop at the base of the boulder. The dogs were pacing furiously on the ice, barking up at the cliff. Silas Vance stepped out into the moonlight. He tipped his lantern up, illuminating his own face. He didn't look angry. He didn't order his men to climb the rocks. He just looked up at me and smiled. It was a slow, sickening, knowing smile. He calmly raised his hand, tipped his hat to me, and then turned around, leading his men back into the woods. They were giving up? My mind raced. Why would they give up? I had the evidence. I was on the path to the mountain pass that would lead me to the next settlement. I turned away from the cliff edge and looked ahead into the dark mountain pass Abigail had directed me towards. The wind howled through the narrow canyon, and then the smell hit me. Not lie, not decay. It was the warm, unmistakable smell of burning wood smoke. I slowly raised my eyes. Through the driving snow, about 100 yards up the pass, a massive 2-story log cabin was built directly into the side of the mountain. Smoke was pouring from its stone chimney. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. I remembered the final entry in Silas's ledger. November 18th. Those of us who remain will move to the high hunting cabin in the peaks. We leave the settlement intact. Abigail hadn't sent me to safety. She hadn't sent me to the road home. Whether she knew it or not, she had given me the exact directions to the new camp, where the rest of the surviving settlement was waiting. I had just climbed into the slaughterhouse.
I stood in the freezing snow, staring at the massive log cabin glowing in the dark mountain pass. Silas hadn't given up. He hadn't shown me mercy at the cliff edge. He just knew the geography of this mountain better than I did. He knew that if he chased me up the right fork of the creek, he was funneling me directly into the jaws of the new camp. Abigail hadn't betrayed me. The poor girl had been buried in a dirt hole for 2 months. She thought this pass was the way to the next settlement. She didn't know Silas had relocated the survivors right in the middle of it. I was trapped. I couldn't go back down the cliff. The dogs and the bear traps were waiting, and I couldn't stay out here in the open. My wet undershirt was frozen solid against my ribs. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. My vision was starting to tunnel, the edges turning a fuzzy, warm black. As a doctor, I knew exactly what that meant. The 3rd stage of hypothermia. The blood was leaving my extremities to protect my organs. In less than 20 minutes, I would simply sit down in the snow, fall asleep,
and never wake up. I had to get to a fire, even if the fire belonged to murderers. I fell to my hands and knees and crawled through the deep powder, using the howling wind to mask the sound of my movement. I reached the back wall of the massive log cabin. Built against the heavy timber was an attached lean-to, a structure made of rough planks with a sloped roof, a woodshed. It shared a wall with the cabin's massive stone chimney. I found the latch, silently lifted it, and slipped inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. It was pitch black, smelling of damp cedar, dried dirt, and curing salt. But more importantly, it was warm. The heat from the cabin's hearth bled through the thick stone chimney, filling the small shed with a life-saving ambient warmth. I collapsed against the stones, violently shaking as the heat began to thaw the ice on my skin. The pain of the blood rushing back into my frozen fingers was excruciating, but I bit down on my sleeve to muffle my groans. I sat there in the dark, clutching Silas's ledger to my chest. As the wind outside died down for a brief moment, I heard voices. They were coming right through the chinking in the logs behind me. The inhabitants of the cabin were sitting right on the other side of the wall. I pressed my ear against the rough wood. "He's been gone for 2 hours," a woman's voice said. It was flat, exhausted, and devoid of any emotion. "The snow is deep. Tracking takes time," a man replied. I heard the scrape of a wooden spoon against an iron pot. "He will find the doctor. Silas doesn't leave loose ends." "And if the doctor shoots him?" the woman asked. "He had a pistol. What if Silas and the hunting party don't come back, Ezekiel?" There was a long pause. I heard the crackle of the fire on the other side of the wall. When the man, Ezekiel, finally spoke, his voice was terrifyingly calm. It sounded exactly like Silas. "I have done the mathematics, Rebecca," Ezekiel said quietly. "Silas took 4 men with him to hunt the doctor. There are only 5 of us left here in the cabin. If Silas does not return, the winter grain will last the 5 of us until May." "And if he does return?" Rebecca asked. Her voice didn't tremble. She was asking a practical question. "Then the grain runs out in March, and we all starve." I stopped breathing. I pressed my face harder against the wood, listening to the absolute collapse of human morality playing out on the other side of the wall. Silas had taught them too well. He had infected them with his brutal logic. The body must amputate a dying limb to survive. He had convinced them to murder their neighbors to save themselves. But the mathematics of starvation don't care about loyalty. The remaining survivors weren't bonded by trauma. They were a circle of wolves, and they had just realized there still wasn't enough meat in the cage. "The autumn skullcap is in the shed." Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper, but I heard it perfectly. "The crushed leaves. I can put them in the stew before they get back. When they come through the door, freezing and tired, they will eat without thinking." "Silas is a strong man," Ezekiel warned. "It will take a heavy dose." "We are the strong ones now," Rebecca replied. "We are only doing what nature demands." A wave of pure, sickening nausea washed over me. It was the exact same justification Silas had written in his ledger, the exact same words. Evil isn't a monster hiding in the woods. It's a rationalization. It's an ordinary person deciding that their life is simply worth more than yours. And then my heart stopped. "The autumn skullcap is in the shed." I heard the scrape of a wooden chair against the floorboards on the other side of the wall. "I'll get the jar," Rebecca said. Footsteps approached the wall. The latch on the heavy wooden door separating the cabin from the shed began to rattle. She was coming in. I frantically scrambled backward in the pitch black. The shed was tiny, maybe 10 feet across. I felt blindly behind me, my hands brushing against rough burlap sacks of grain and heavy cords of stacked firewood. There was nowhere to hide. If she opened that door with a lantern, she would see me instantly. I was a dead man. I backed myself into the deepest, darkest corner of the shed, wedging my body between two massive wooden curing barrels. I pulled my knees to my chest and drew my flintlock pistol, pointing it directly at the door. Clack! The iron latch lifted. The heavy door swung open, casting a long rectangular beam of orange firelight into the dusty shed. Rebecca stepped into the doorway. She was a tall, severe-looking woman, holding a small oil lantern in one hand. Her eyes were sunken, shadowed by the flickering light. She stepped into the room. The door swung partially shut behind her, dimming the light. She didn't look toward my corner. She walked straight to a high wooden shelf on the opposite wall. She reached up, her fingers searching for something in the dark. I sat frozen, the barrel of my pistol aimed squarely at her back. My finger was resting heavily on the trigger. If I shot her, Ezekiel would rush in with a musket. I would die. If I didn't shoot her, Silas and his men would return, eat the poison stew, and die, and I would still be trapped in this shed, freezing to death. Rebecca's fingers found what they were looking for. She pulled down a small, heavy clay jar, the crushed leaves, the poison. She turned around to leave. But as she turned, her boot caught the edge of my frozen, waterlogged coat, which I had dragged across the floor when I scrambled backward. She stopped. She looked down at the dark, wet trail on the dusty floorboards, a trail leading directly to the barrels I was hiding behind. Slowly, agonizingly, Rebecca raised the lantern. The orange light washed over the wooden barrels. It illuminated my muddy, torn boots. It illuminated my bleeding hands. And finally, it illuminated my face. We stared at each other in the dim light. Her eyes widened in pure shock. Her mouth opened, drawing in a breath to scream for Ezekiel. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. Survival took over. I lunged out from behind the barrels, grabbing her by the throat with my left hand, driving her violently backward against the rough wooden wall. I slammed the barrel of my pistol directly under her chin, pinning her in place before she could make a sound. The lantern dropped from her hand, shattering on the dirt floor, plunging us both into near darkness. Not a sound, I hissed, my voice trembling with a terrifying primal rage I didn't know I possessed. Not a sound. If you breathe heavy, I will blow your jaw off. Rebecca's eyes were wide with terror. She nodded frantically, choking against my grip. I leaned in close, the smell of her sweat and the shattered oil lantern burning my nose. I heard everything, I whispered, pressing the iron barrel harder against her skin. I know what you're planning to do to Silas. I looked at the clay jar of poison that had rolled onto the floor next to my boot. Then I looked back into her terrified eyes, and in that moment, shivering in the freezing dark, surrounded by murderers, I made my own calculation. You're going to pick up that jar, I whispered, my voice going dead and hollow, and I am going to watch.
You're going to put it in the stew, I whispered, the barrel of my pistol pressing hard against the underside of Rebecca's jaw, and I am going to watch. Rebecca's eyes darted wildly in the dim light of the shed. She was terrified, but beneath that terror, I saw something else. I saw the cold, rational acceptance of a woman who had already decided that murder was simply a tool for survival. I was merely changing the target. This was the true horror of Gideon's Ridge. It wasn't monsters in the woods. It was human choices, human failures, and human cruelties. That's what made it genuinely terrible.
Slowly, her trembling fingers reached down and picked up the heavy clay jar of crushed autumn skullcap. "If I do this," she choked out, her breath ghosting in the freezing air, "Silas will kill us both if he tastes the bitterness." "He won't taste it," I replied, my voice dead and hollow. "He's been out in the freezing wind for hours. His senses will be completely dulled by the cold. Put a heavy dose in the pot. Then you will open the root cellar door beneath the cabin. I will hide down there. If you warn him, if you even look at him the wrong way, I will shoot you through the floorboards." She nodded. Slowly, I lowered the gun, though I kept the hammer cocked. I followed her out of the freezing shed and stepped into the suffocating heat of the main cabin. The cabin was massive, built of thick, raw timber. A massive iron pot hung over a roaring fire in the stone hearth, bubbling with a thick venison stew. Sitting in a rocking chair by the fire was Ezekiel, casually whittling a piece of pine. He looked up as Rebecca entered, his eyes briefly widening as he saw me step out of the shadows behind her, the heavy pistol aimed squarely at his chest. "Not a word, Ezekiel," I whispered. "Stand up, move to the wall." Ezekiel raised his hand slowly, dropping his knife, and backed away. He didn't panic. These people had lived with death for 2 months. Violence was just another Tuesday to them. "Put it in," I ordered Rebecca. She walked to the hearth. Her hands shook as she uncorked the clay jar. She tipped it over the iron pot. A cascade of dried, crushed leaves fell into the boiling broth. She grabbed a wooden spoon and stirred it deeply. The smell of the meat masked the poison completely. It was a perfect, invisible weapon. "The cellar," I commanded. Ezekiel pointed to a heavy iron ring in the center of the floorboards. I backed toward it, keeping my gun leveled at them. I pulled the ring, lifting the heavy trapdoor. A ladder led down into a small, dark crawl space used for storing root vegetables. I climbed down, leaving the trapdoor open just a crack, a sliver of an inch, so I could see the heavy wooden dining table and hear everything in the room above. "Sit at the table," I whispered up through the crack, "and wait." Heavy fists pounded on the front door of the cabin. My heart slammed against my ribs. I tightened my grip on the pistol, crouching in the dark, dirt-floored cellar. "And open the door, Ezekiel," Silas's voice boomed from the freezing night outside. "The wind is turning." Above me, I heard Ezekiel's heavy boots cross the floorboards. The heavy iron latch clacked open. A rush of freezing wind howled into the cabin, followed by the heavy, exhausted thud of boots. 5 men piled into the room, covered head to toe in snow, their faces red and wind-burned. They were shivering violently, slapping their frozen hands together. "Did you find him?" asked Rebecca. Her voice was remarkably steady. She was a terrifyingly good liar. Silas walked to the hearth, unbuttoning his heavy wool coat. He looked furious, but his voice was as calm and measured as ever. "No," Silas muttered, rubbing his hands over the fire. "He completely vanished. We tracked his footprints to the creek, but he didn't cross. People who disappear into snowstorms leave traces, but the doctor left nothing. He must have fallen through the ice and been pulled under the current." I held my breath in the dark. He actually believed I was dead. "It's over then," Ezekiel said, pulling out a wooden chair. "The law won't come back until the spring thaw." "Serve the stew, Rebecca," Silas commanded, collapsing into the large armchair at the head of the heavy wooden table. "We are freezing from the inside out." Through the narrow crack in the floorboards, I watched Rebecca carry the heavy iron pot to the table. Steam poured off the boiling broth. She ladled thick, heavy portions into 5 wooden bowls, setting them down in front of Silas and his 4 hunting companions. She did not serve herself. She did not serve Ezekiel. Silas didn't even notice. He was starving. He picked up his wooden spoon, dipped it into the thick broth, and raised it to his lips. I watched the muscles in his throat swallow. He closed his eyes, letting out a long, satisfied exhale as the warm food hit his freezing stomach. The other 4 men followed suit, greedily tearing into their meals, slurping the broth and chewing the heavy venison. It was a quiet, domestic scene. If you didn't know what was happening, it would look like a family dinner. But I knew I was watching an execution. "We are safe now," Silas said softly, staring into the fire as he took another spoonful. "I am aware that what I have done would be judged harshly by those who lack the capacity to understand necessity." He took another bite, chewing slowly. The poison was already coating his throat. "I am not concerned with their judgment," Silas continued, his voice echoing in the quiet cabin. "The weak do not survive in nature. I only enforced what nature intended. I have no regrets." Above me, Rebecca and Ezekiel stood silently by the wall, watching the men eat. They were enforcing nature too, just in a different direction. It took exactly 12 minutes. Because the dose was so heavily concentrated, the symptoms hit them fast. The man sitting to Silas's right, a large bearded logger, suddenly stopped chewing. He dropped his spoon. His hands began to shake violently. Tremors. "Silas, my chest, it's burning." Silas turned to look at him, but as he did, his own eyes widened. He gripped the edge of the heavy oak table. His knuckles turned completely white. A sudden terrible paleness washed over his face. "The meat," Silas choked, his voice suddenly sounding wet and strained. One of the other men violently gagged, an inability to retain food hitting him instantly as his body desperately tried to reject the toxic poison. He collapsed out of his chair, hitting the floorboards right above my head with a sickening thud. Panic erupted. "Rebecca!" Silas roared, trying to stand up, but his legs completely gave out. He crashed back into his chair, gasping for air as the autumn skullcap paralyzed his respiratory system. He looked at the empty bowls, then he looked at Rebecca and Ezekiel, who were still standing completely still by the wall. In that moment, Silas understood. The brilliant, cold-blooded mathematician realized that his own equation had finally been used against him. "You," Silas hissed, blood beginning to trickle from his nose. "You poisoned us." 20 was still too many, Silas, Ezekiel said quietly, stepping forward. "We did the math. The grain will last the 2 of us until May." With a sudden, terrifying roar of adrenaline, Silas lunged across the table. Even with a lethal dose of poison in his veins, the man was an absolute monster. He grabbed the heavy iron pot of boiling poison stew and hurled it directly at Ezekiel. The boiling liquid splashed across Ezekiel's chest and face. Ezekiel screamed in sheer agony, falling backward into the hearth. Rebecca screamed, turning to run for the door, but one of the dying men grabbed her ankle, dragging her to the floorboards. It was absolute cosmic carnage, a room full of murderers tearing each other apart in their final agonizing moments. I didn't wait to see who won. I shoved the trapdoor all the way open, climbing out of the cellar and sprinting blindly for the heavy wooden front door of the cabin. I hit the iron latch, throwing the door open to the freezing, howling winter night. "The doctor!" Silas screamed from the floor, his vision fading, pointing a trembling, blackened finger at me as I stood in the doorway. I looked back at him. I held up his leather ledger. "You won't fade away into the winter, Silas," I yelled over the wind. "I'm going to make sure the whole world knows exactly what you did." I turned and plunged into the blinding snow, running straight for the mountain pass. But as I broke through the tree line, leaving the screaming cabin behind me, a massive, heavy shadow dropped from the branches of the pine tree directly above me. landing squarely on my back and driving me face first into the frozen earth.
The shadow slammed into my back with the weight of an anvil, driving my face straight into the freezing powder. A deafening, wet snarl erupted right next to my ear. It was the last mastiff. The hound I had kicked off the ice had tracked my blood all the way up the ridge. Its massive, rusted jaws snapped shut, sinking deep into the thick leather of my vest, mere inches from my spine. I screamed violently, rolling my body over in the deep snow. The beast scrambled on top of me, its yellow eyes wide and crazed with starvation. Saliva dripped onto my face as it lunged for my throat. I didn't have my pistol. I didn't have my knife. All I had in my hands was Silas's heavy leather ledger. I shoved the thick, frozen book directly into the dog's open mouth. The mastiff bit down violently, its teeth sinking deep into the leather binding, tearing through the pages of Silas's horrific confessions. The dog thrashed its head, trying to rip the book out of my hands, but I held on with the desperate, burning strength of a man refusing to die. I pulled my knees up to my chest, placed both of my boots squarely against the dog's ribcage, and kicked upward with every ounce of strength I had left. The beast flew off me, tumbling backward down the steep, icy embankment. It let out a sharp yelp as it crashed into the thick, jagged pines below. I didn't wait to see if it would climb back up. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the torn, punctured ledger to my chest, and stumbled blindly into the mountain pass. I walked for hours, or maybe it was days. Time simply stopped existing in the whiteout of the blizzard. My mind fractured into 1,000 splintered memories. I saw the frozen stew on the tables. I saw the rocks in the coffins. I saw Abigail's hollow purple face in the dirt. I don't remember crossing the pass. I don't remember finding the main road. The only thing I remember is the sound of a wagon driver yelling, the sudden warmth of a wool blanket, and waking up 3 weeks later in a hospital bed in Boston. I had survived. I lost 2 toes to the frost, and my lungs would rattle for the rest of my life, but I was alive. As soon as I could stand, I demanded an audience with the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I brought Silas's torn ledger. I brought my own notes. I was ready to lead a contingent of armed guards back to Gideon's Ridge to arrest whoever survived the poisoned stew and to retrieve the bodies of the innocent. I sat in the governor's warm, oak-paneled office. I placed the ledger on his desk, and I told him everything. The governor listened in absolute silence. He read the pages. He saw the cold, calculated mathematics of murder. When I finished, he closed the book. He looked at me for a long time. Then he stood up, walked over to his massive stone hearth, and tossed the ledger directly into the fire. "What are you doing?" I screamed, lunging out of my chair. 2 armed guards instantly grabbed my shoulders, slamming me back into the seat. "I am saving this colony, Dr. Thorne," the governor said quietly, watching the pages burn. "Do you know what would happen if London heard that a Puritan settlement devolved into mass murder and poisoning at the first sign of a hard winter? The funding would stop. The ships would stop coming. The entire Massachusetts Bay Colony would collapse. I said there are bodies in a lye vat. I said there is a girl named Abigail Miller who died alone in a dirt hole." "There was an outbreak of pox," the governor corrected me, his voice ironclad and terrifyingly calm. "The winter was harsh. Gideon's Ridge was lost to disease. It is a tragedy, and it is the only story that will ever be written down." I sat there, watching the smoke curl up the chimney. In that moment, I realized that Silas Vance and the governor of Massachusetts Bay were the exact same kind of man.
They both believed that the body must amputate a dying limb to survive. To the governor, the truth of Gideon's ridge was a diseased limb, and he was cutting it off. I learned that wealth and political power was a form of insulation so complete that it was effectively invisible. It was the operation of a system in which every individual made a rational calculation about their own interests and came to the same conclusion independently, without discussion. Nobody needed to tell the guards to keep quiet. They knew exactly what it would cost them to speak. I was given a pouch of silver and told that if I ever spoke of the ledger again, I would hang for treason. It has been 40 years since that winter. I am an old man now. The world has moved on. The town of Gideon's Ridge was reclaimed by the forest long ago. Everything that happened in that settlement happened because of people, human choices, human failures, human cruelties. There is no grave for Abigail Miller. There is no stone. There is no marker of any kind to indicate that a young girl existed, had lived, had spoken, and then gone silent, removed from the world as efficiently as a line item deleted from a ledger. I am writing this account and hiding it beneath the floorboards of my own home, praying that someday someone will find it. Not as a ghost story, not as a mystery solved, but as an account of what people do to each other when no one is watching. Because out there, in the deep, dark winter woods, the trees are still growing, the snow is still falling, and the dead are still waiting to be found. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. If this descent into the frozen woods kept you awake, please do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, leave a like on the video, and share it with someone who loves true, grounded horror. Before you go to sleep tonight, let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were trapped in that cabin? Would you have served the stew? Thank you for watching. Make sure your doors are locked, and I'll see you in the next one.